This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
There's something interesting phenomenon that I've observed regarding Techeiles. You'd expect it to be a pretty straightforward shayla, pretty straightforward sugya. Somebody's presenting perhaps an interesting new chumrah, an interesting new halacha, and the reaction should be pretty straightforward. We have a lot of patterns for other such. People are proposing other similar proposals. I don't know. If I'd show up with a new kind of esrog. For years in Europe, I think the only esrog that was widely available was the Italian esrog. And, people bump into Yemenites and to Moroccans, and then, the shayla is going to come up regarding the pros and cons of, using a Yemenite esrog, what the rayas would be. Would you go with rayas? Would be taking in the traditions of the Yemenites, how good or bad they would be. Would they be better or worse than the Moroccans, and then the Moroccan and the Yemenites against the regular minhag and so on? There's a regular pattern that we have in the Sefer HaPesachim for such a shayla. And surprisingly, I don't see that pattern taking place when it comes to Techeiles. There seems to be an automatic knee-jerk reaction that, no, we don't have Techeiles. That's not noch a keduma. If you start the shayla of Techeiles, you expect, I'm proposing a proposal. Let's deal it, according to the merits of the evidence. And it would seem, from the way, from the reactions I've gotten over the years, that people assume as a davar pasha. No, it can't be. I'm not very sure where that comes from, but I've noticed a mirror image of that reaction, somehow the other way around, when it comes to people who are pro-Techeiles, that you see that they suddenly there's some kind of energy to the pro-Techeiles people. They make it sound a little more, the positivity that they have is a little bit beyond the regular proposal of yet another chumrah. Yeah, there's a leaflet over here that I'm the guilty party. I was behind this nearly 15 years ago. Actually, about 15, 16 years ago I wrote this in an earlier Madura. I haven't seen similar, pamphlets being given out proposing that we should or shouldn't use niputz l'shman or tzitzis, or what kind of ink we should be using in our tefillin, even though those discussions should be, again, pretty similar. And what I've come to realize, and this is something that really is a backdrop of the whole sugya and gives a lot of coloring to the entire shayla, is we tend to associate Techeiles for some reason. I can't say anyone I understand entirely why. We tend to associate Techeiles with something to do with the gula. There could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be entirely psychological. It could be the fact that it matches the color of a certain country's flag. It could be a lot of other things that, to a certain extent, the fact that we didn't have a mitzvah for so long, and it was the davar pasha by the Pesachim who discussed it, has a lot of relevance, understanding the sugya of tzitzis, we'll see a little later. Techeiles has a lot of relevance even when you don't have Techeiles, regarding perhaps how many strings you have in tzitzis, how many strings could rip in your tzitzis while it still would be kosher, and so on and so forth. So in the middle of the Pesachim are forced to discuss a lot about Techeiles, and any such discussion will assume, at some point when we have Techeiles one day, and obviously it's going to be, the gist of it's going to be when Mashiach comes, you'll have Techeiles. To a large extent, I think that's part of the culprit, that we tend to associate Techeiles with, pass them around, might help for the tzibur. We tend to associate Techeiles memela with something to do with the gula. There could be more to it than that, but the very idea of a mitzvah disappearing and being brought back to Klal Yisrael is something that has almost no parallel, and as such was always associated. Mashiach for sure is going to bring back Techeiles, and then the next extension of that statement is Techeiles won't come back until Mashiach is here. If you look through Pesachim, you won't find a serious attitude like that. You won't find any of the major Pesachim saying that Techeiles is a mitzvah, it's totally in the Mikdash. You will find overtones of such ideas, such as the Arizal, for example, who associates the lack of Techeiles with something to do with the world that we live in, the non-Geula world, and obviously Memela is going to come back when Mashiach comes. If you know a little bit about Arizal, you obviously realize regardless of the horror of Rabbi Akiva Eger, the Elav Tishmon, I'm sure you're familiar. Even if we would look at the Arizal as a Navi, the question is what the import of his statement is. It's a little bit parenthetical. I'll just say the Arizal tends in general to try to interpret reality based on Teres Asayid. So the Arizal would find it a valid discussion to discuss why usually the boy is older than the girl in a marriage. Some Sfaradim will tell you, therefore, you shouldn't marry a girl that's older than you. And there's a beautiful tshuva from Yaakov Hillel, where he says, no, the Arizal is just interpreting reality. Doesn't mean that you have to do it like that. I'll just throw out there's a beautiful piece I found years ago from the Divrei Yoel, the Satmar actually. He writes, it's not clear what his insinuation is. I think we could pretty easily guess what his insinuation is. But the Satmar says that we see from the Python, it's actually a pretty early piyut, Asher Heini, which we say after the Megillah. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the piyut Asher Heini, but in Asher Heini, it finishes off, Sheshan and Yaakov, Tzalvas Mech, Beresim Yachad, Techeiles Mordechai. And using this Arizal, the Satmar says a beautiful drush that seeing Mordechai with Techeiles was sort of seeing the beginning of the Geula. The insinuation from the Satmar, by the way, is that today, of course, when there's no Techeiles, there's of course no Geula, which might, to a certain extent, be able to explain a little bit of some of the snagdus that's out there in the world, perhaps. I just find that interesting, or perhaps intriguing. Again, the way the Satmar looks at it, of course, is that even before the Geula comes, there's going to be Techeiles, and he says it pretty clearly, like having. I think he even uses in the context the words Eschalta de Geula. Seeing Mordechai with Techeiles would be a remiss for Eschalta de Geula or something like that. In any case, putting that all aside, there are midrashim here and there that say certain things like the fact that Techeiles is nignaz. In the world of halacha, which one example I bring on the sheet in front of you is a Ma'aril, regarding the question of, it actually was one of the most hotly contested shilas in the period of the Geonim, as to whether a linen talis would be chayiv in tzitzis. The Gemara says a talis that's made out of linen is not chayiv in tzitzis because, or at the very least not chayiv in Techeiles, because somebody might use Techeiles that's puzzle, and kalayim b'tzitzis, putting on wool tzitzis, would only be mutter if you have Techeiles, which must be with wool. Otherwise, I'd be able to use linen tzitzis. And Memela, the Gemara explains it's a little bit of a complicated Gemara and a big complicated Tosfos. But the bottom line is that there's no tzitzis when there's either no Techeiles or no tzitzis on a linen garment. But that's all contingent on Techeiles existing. And therefore the shaila arises, what would happen in our day and age, say the Paiskim, when we don't have any Techeiles? Would you be able to wear a talis made out of linen? The shaila comes up periodically. You see it in Shulchan Aruch, much earlier in the Geonim. It was still a widely contested shaila till the times of the Vilna Gaon, when some people in Vilna did wear linen talisim, some people didn't. In the Vilna Gaon's own lifetime, this has nothing to do with the Shir, there was a widely contested shaila in his lifetime as to what the Vilna Gaon's talis is made out of in his lifetime. One of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. It turns out it's probably some kind of other interesting material, but not for right now. Again, the shaila is whether bisman hazeh, when there's no Techeiles, if you'd be able to wear tzitzis on a linen talis. And that's, of course, dependent on whether there isn't Techeiles. If there's no Techeiles and there's no chance of Techeiles coming back, then, well, nothing really to be concerned with, because people are just going to use linen tzitzis, and nobody's going to put on pasul Techeiles, because nobody wears Techeiles at all, and you're back to regular white linen tzitzis on a white linen talis, and life is grand. And the Maharil says, in the Chuvas Maharil in the Ksav Yad, it's known as the Chuvas Maharil HaChadashis, a sefer that the Beis Yos have had, he just called them Chuvas Ashkenaziyos. And the Maharil over there says that you can't just write off this possibility because who knows, maybe Techeiles will come back. You could see it right in the beginning. It's the first statement on the first page of the page leaflet. It says, "Usvaruhu shem yachzer davar lekalkule she'et Techeiles matzeh." It's plausible, reasonable that Techeiles might come back, especially since the smag, and he's just quoting the Rambam, do the smag, that the Dag Chilazon is matzoi, and it's in the Yam HaMelach. I point out in the footnote, Yam HaMelach is just Hebraism of an Arabic term meaning the Yam HaGadol. And Bekal lo hayalas Techeiles. It should theoretically be easy to make Techeiles. Why he didn't go make Techeiles? Obviously, the Mayor lives in Germany. I don't know how many times in his life the Mayor actually was able to see the sea. And I don't know if he would have known, whether it was possible. Sometimes you would wonder if it's Bekal to make Techeiles. Go ahead and do it. But putting that question aside, which perhaps we'll get back to a little later, the Maril and many other Pesachim to the Dairis discuss the Shaila Techeiles, and they don't make this association with the Gula. The flip side, in basic logic, if it's raining, I carry an umbrella. If I'm carrying an umbrella, it doesn't necessarily imply that it's raining. It might be a brisker. There could be a lot of other reasons I'd be carrying an umbrella. That's the basic flaw in logic. When Mashiach comes, there will be Techeiles, but that doesn't imply that if not Mashiach, they're not Techeiles. That's, in any case, the feeling that I get from the Pesachim. Perhaps we'll get back to this in detail after this year. Being as such, theoretically, the Shaila should be, again, fairly simple. Let's just figure out what you make Techeiles from and get it from there. It doesn't really work so well. You look at the Gemara, there's a Gemara, which actually perhaps comes from a Tosefta, perhaps is just a parallel source. We find that the Gemara that Techeiles is made from a Chilazon. I don't know how many of you have 3-4-year-old kids in the local kindergartens, but one of the basic yitzirot in the fall is actually a song about it that the kids sing. No idea exactly how the song goes, but there's a lot of different songs about the fall and the rain and the Chilazon, as the kids call it, and all the kids, of course, know Chilazon is a snail, right? There's no real questions about that. The reason why we're so sure about it is thanks to a brilliant scholar by the name of Eliezer, I think Perlman, Ben Yehuda, of course, who revives the Hebrew language and needs a word for snail, and of course pulls out the word Chilazon. He has no doubts about it, and that, of course, influences our kids who have no sfeikas. Ben Yehuda was a big baki in Gemara. He's a brilliant scholar. He is well worthy of the job that he did. The source that he gives, though, in his monumental dictionary is not the Gemaras, which we'll see in a moment. Basically, you can ask any local Arab and many other Middle Eastern languages, Syriac, both Eastern and Western Syriac, Farsi, and many other Middle Eastern languages. There's a commonly used word, halazun, halzuno, a couple of different ways to say it, and it means snail. Actually, it's always fun to get something mesiach lefitume from a guy because that's how it works. I remember years back, I learned in a kollel in Rechavia, Netzach Yisrael, Ramailas. There was a hall upstairs, and it was in the winter, Shkia was early in the middle of second Seder, and I was standing in the front, I think talking on my phone. I don't remember exactly what I was doing. It was raining, of course. Anyone knows in Yerushalayim, you'll see lots of slugs. Perhaps we'll get to that a little later. Snails. And there was this Arab fellow going in and out of the hall with a big crates of food and plates and stuff like that. And as he's walking in and out, I'm watching, there's this big, huge snail on the floor. He's walking through and goes crunch, splat. I hear that Arab go with a couple of good curses, and then halazuno. I got my goy mesiach lefitumai. This would be kashal halacha for any other sugya in Shas. But putting Ben Yehuda aside, I think it would be fairly easy to come to the conclusion that a Chilazon is a snail. You'd be surprised how surprising that is. If you're living in Europe 100, 200 years ago, you look at anything in the Gemara potentially as some kind of shade. What would you know? I don't know what the Chilazon is. I still remember I had a conversation, I think about 15 years ago, with a big Talmud Chacham, some today's a known Talmud Chacham from England. I was in England for a visit, and this Talmud Chacham was schmoozing. It was the night after a wedding. It was late at night. We had taken a ride back together from northern England to the middle of England and to London, I think. And we're schmoozing about all kinds of different things. And he asked, what are you doing? What are you up to? What are you doing in Yerushalayim? And I said, lately I've become interested in the sugya of Techeiles. Techeiles? So I said, yeah, Techeiles. I said, I've even got the Chilazon under my bed in my deer, in a little tub. And he looks at me as if I just told him that I collect dragons. You've got the Chilazon? I said, yeah, most certainly. What's the problem? I'm looking at his face, and there's the most utter shock. Entirely not put on. Besides, trying to figure out what's so surprising. And at some point, he blurts out, but it's huge. Where do you get that from? After another couple of minutes of going around the bush, I suddenly realized, in his mind, there's one creature called a Chilazon, or Leviathan, something like that. He had lumped the Chilazon and the Leviathan into one creature. Without any jokes, what's going on in his mind, something in the Gemara isn't necessarily something in the here and now in the real world. I mean, it's not something you'd expect to find as you're walking down the street. If you look through the Gemara, that would entirely not be the impression you get. Where do we find the Chilazon? There's a couple of different contexts where it pops up in Midrashim. One of the ones that I find most telling is a Medrash quoted in Rashi. I bring it in the second column, where I talk about the Chilazon. The first is the Tosefta and the Gemara that says Techeiles comes from a Chilazon. The Tosefta actually says that if it's not from a Chilazon, Techeiles is puzzle. Perhaps later we'll discuss why that would be. And it says, you see in the parentheses over there, it's a little bit too long. I have to admit, this paper was made to impress Charedim. There's something, when it comes to yeshivish people, that if you want to impress them, you got to show that you're a heavy hitter. You throw as many Marmakimis as you can, if possible in tiny font, if possible in tiny Rashi font, and then you got the guys. If you got a lot of Marmakimis in tiny Rashi font with a lot of abbreviations, then you've made it. That's a conclusive argument. So I pander to that, embarrassingly. And I write about the fact that it has a Ba'alat Kunchiyah. There's a Dvarim Rabbah, Shirim Rabbah, many other Midrashim. Of course, it's the same Medrash appearing in parallel sources, where it talks about the Yidden in the Midbar. Klal Yisrael in the Midbar, they grow and they don't have any new clothes. And the Medrash asks, or some person in the Medrash asks, if they're not growing, what's happening to their clothes? Right? And the Medrash says, no, their clothes is growing with them. And don't be surprised, Hare Matzanu Chilazon, Kozman Shu Gadol, Beisayin, Artikoi, Levushay Gadol Imay, something like that. Now you can always write this off that it just means the skin. If it means the skin, why would you have to go to Chilazon? Let's just use human. As humans grow, the skin grows with them. Right? Obviously what we're trying to say is that no, it's not just your skin, it's something exterior, something surprising that you'd see it grow with you. Something that puzzled people in the ancient world on creatures that seem to have an inorganic shell that's a rock for all practical purposes. It actually is a rock, and it doesn't seem to be connected to the exterior of the shell, and somehow every year it's getting bigger and bigger. Indeed, Pilei Abriya. In any case, the fact that we're describing the Chilazon as something that has a shell that grows bigger, an exterior shell, I think that would be enough to prove it to be a snail. If that weren't enough, there's Yerushalmi that talks about whether you can or can't kill a Chilazon on Shabbos. It's part of a bigger sugya. The famous sugya about killing lice really is part and parcel of that, but that's a different sugya. And within the context, it asks about things that live 6 months have skin and have bones and gidim. And the Chilazon is brought up. What about the Chilazon? It lives more than 6 months, or a Chilazon, perhaps I should say. A Chilazon can live for more than 6 months, and it doesn't seem like it has bones and gidin. And then it answers, perhaps it does, like every other Yerushalmi you left when you finished learning the Yerushalmi, scratching it. Was that all bitmiyah? Was the end bitmiyah? Is it a bayid le'ifshet or something else? And like every other Yerushalmi, you'll find as many mefarshim as there are on the sugya, there are mahalchim. But the basic gist that you can pull out of the Yerushalmi is that it's certainly the understanding of Yerushalmi that you wouldn't expect the Chilazon to have gidim ba'atzamis. In other words, they're talking about some squishy, mushy thing that has a shell. I think that's a fair description of a snail. Putting that together with the fact that the Chilazon in Arabic and all these other languages, which by the way, over the years I've gotten it more and more times. I was shooting a documentary film about Techeiles, and as we're schmoozing about it, and schmoozing about the filming, we're talking about Chilazon, and the taxi driver, who wasn't Jewish, was here in Israel though, he's like looking at me puzzled. I said, he's like looking like he seems to recognize something. I said, so we're talking about a halazuna. Halazuna, yeah, sadafe. And this happened many other times since. There's no sfekus about it. The one Arab who I ended up shooting for the video, after we finished, shooting the video, I said, like, what's this? And he says, halazun, and so on. So after you finish videoing him, I give him 100 shekel for his help. He said, hey, for another 200 shekel, I'll call whatever you want. But Mesiach Lefitume is Mesiach Lefitume, and any other, there's no end of dictionaries and so on and so forth that you can get to back up this point. Chilazon is most certainly a snail. It has a lot of relevance regarding the end of the sugya, because everything we're going to discuss about the Chilazon is going to have to be in the context of a snail that, whatever. In other words, if I were to demonstrate that a Chilazon has tzeda, for example, so give us Shabbos, that you'd be chayiv tzod for trapping a Chilazon, perhaps. That wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't therefore say that Chilazon must have wings. Like I actually was once told by someone. I'm not sure where you got it from. I actually went to Zalman Achemia after that discussion in which a well-known Pesach told me, where's the Chilazon's wings? By the way, what I answered to him at the time was, I looked at him like, where do you get that from? So that's a Techeiles teretz. Where did I get that from? So I thought for a moment. I said, what are you talking about? Right after it says that has wings, it says, Kivin she'etz ma'ayam, miyad noishreis. And he looks at me, oh, okay. Neither source exists, of course. Right? So I went back to Zalman Achemi Goldberg, and again, I was very disappointed by the turn of the conversation, and that's really what he told me afterwards. People tend, things that you're not familiar, you lump together. He probably lumped it with the Benisa de Beikar, bringing Maseches Makkos. But I wouldn't be able, what he was coming from in reality was the fact that you have Tzeda by a Chilazon. This has got to be something you can get away from me quickly. However, there's no such thing as a snail that can run very quickly. Perhaps a snail that can swim, perhaps, which is also rare. Mollusks of the snail type don't really have any muscles that they should be able to swim very quickly with. And Mamela, we're going to have to look for a different interpretation. But the basic fact that Chilazon means a snail, I would say is 100% conclusive. So the shayla would be automatically, which snail are we looking for? We can't just go to the yam and look for no end of snails. There is a Gemara that gives us a little bit of information. There's a Gemara Maseches Menachos where it looks more than anything like an Agadata. I bring it, I think, on the third page in the middle of the centerfold. There's a brisa about the Chilazon and Maseches Menachos. Chilazon doimel yam, briyasei doimel adag, oila achas Hashem shano, ubedame tzeven Techeiles. It's a little bit problematic for a very simple reason. There's almost no statement in that description that's in any way definitive. Doimel yam can have multiple meanings, a whole range of colors, and doesn't exactly explain what part of the snail is doimel yam. Its eyes, its antennae, the body, the shell. Doimel dag. We have other such brises about Briyasei Daimon, like about the Shamir and various other places, about a Nefel and Maseches Nida. You have this kind of terminology, and it's not very helpful. The only statement over here that's really helpful, which is pretty much circular, is the fact that you die from Techeiles. We know that you die from Techeiles. That's not going to help us identify it. But the truth is, really, if you use that as a starting point, I think you get to the conclusion in the most constructive manner. If we were to look for Techeiles and to understand as a Davar Pasha that Techeiles is something that's unique to Jews and something that's perhaps semi-mystical or semi-supernatural, so we really have no hope of looking for it. But if you look through Chazal, you can see that Techeiles is something perfectly natural. When the Bnei Yisrael come out of Mitzrayim, they have Techeiles from somewhere. Likely as not, again, this might be dependent on a sugi whether you do or don't need the Shema for the Klei HaMishkan. But likely as not, they would have taken it from the Egyptians. Yaakov Avinu, according to one manuscript in a Medrash Rabbah, one of the things that he sends Yosef, not knowing that he's Yosef, amongst the whole present, he sends him Chilazon, right? Which means that the Medrash is understanding, regardless as to whether this is or isn't historical fact, the Medrash is understanding that sending Chilazon would be a normal thing for one royalty to send to another royalty. This is a chashuv thing, and this is not specifically unique to Jews. You find all through Tanakh people wearing Techeiles. You find Mordechai wearing Techeiles, Achashverosh wearing Techeiles. The Gemara talks about Nebuchadnezzar leaving in Eretz Yisrael, Jews after Churban Bayis Rishon, Lakarmim v'la Yegvim, and the Gemara says, what are Yegvim? The people are trapping the Chilazon, right, for the clothes of Nebuchadnezzar. The context, the impression that you're getting from the whole Shas is that Techeiles, like everything else, is not unique to Jews. I've never seen anyone try to claim that, let's say, I don't know, Zahav if I tried to make a tzitz today for the Kohen Gadol, I don't think there's anybody that would venture that perhaps Zahav is something, I don't know, something entirely unique to Jews. It's see-through. I'll find a couple of Agadatas about Zahav. I'll tell you that there are 9 types of Zahav, 5 types of Zahav in Maseches Yuma. The indication for the Gemara Maseches Yuma is that pure Zahav can be 5 different colors, and that doesn't seem to be true about the material that in modern Hebrew we call Zahav. So no, there's Zahav, and that's Zahav, and of course what we like calling gold is just Bash Allah. I think we would all realize that such a contention is entirely ridiculous. I saw a kuntras, a spoof, on many of the anti-Techeiles literatures, and it's a whole seemingly serious-looking article trying to prove that what we call wine from grapes is not yayin, and what we call concord grapes are not grapes. And he has no end of midrashim about the shape of a grape, the size of a grape, what real yayin does, and yayin is mesameach, even if it's less than ervius, and we call wine is entirely not. And a long list, and he says the obvious conclusion, of course, is that what we call wine is not wine, and concord grapes are not grapes. And chas v'shalom to make a bari priyagofen on it, and right. And yayin shalahem, you were able to be meizig at 1 to 4, and still was wine, and still make a shaker, and so on and so forth. The reason why we assume that not to be is because yayin is something that's never unique to Jews, something that everyone's got, and we've had it all through the generations. And anybody who knows Proto-Semitic and Ugarit, Sumerian, Eblite, and practically every other language we have from the Middle East and from the Middle West and pretty much everywhere, is that yayin is yayin, and it's a common phenomenon. Techeiles would seem in Tanakh and all kinds of other external sources to be something universal. Just to top it off, we have a Gemara that talks about finding Techeiles in the street, just like finding tefillin and discussing, and I might say tefillin, of course, whether it is or isn't kosher. The Gemara talks about finding Techeiles, and the discussion, of course, is how do you know it's Techeiles? Maybe it's imitation Techeiles. Maybe it is imitation Techeiles made from the indigo plant, of course. Maybe it's not lishma, and that's extremely important. By saying that it might be not lishma, a diet of the glima tzavinu. Maybe somebody found this Techeiles. You find a piece of Techeiles in the street. How do you know you can use it for your tzitzis? Maybe somebody made it for his jacket. Maybe somebody made it for the fringes of his cloak. And which is what the Gemara contends as a possibility. The second I see that means that the Gemara assumes as a davar pashat that there are people who are wearing Techeiles not just for a mitzvah. Techeiles is not unique to Jews. It's not unique to Jews for ritual purposes on their ritual garments. It's something that everyone's using. So really, all I would need to find, and I think this would be the best way to find it, is to start from the end of the brayso. So, let's find the Techeiles that's being used. So we would look for a dye. That's Techeiles, theoretically, whatever color Techeiles is. We'll get to that in a moment. And work from there and find some non-Jewish dye that's used at the same time in places Chazal, and theoretically that would be Techeiles. I would need to tack on one more caveat. It's got to be made from a snail. If I were to find a blue dye, see I jumped ahead, if I were to find a dye from a snail, I think that would be enough for it, especially if I don't find a lot of dyes being made from any snail. What color is Techeiles? Parenthetically, we all know, of course, Techeiles is Tchelet, if you know modern Hebrew. Not really so accurate. Again, that's Ben Yehuda doing his work. It so happens to be, if you speak Russian. Anyone here speaks Russian? No Russian speakers? Russian. English has 2 words for red. We call it either red or pink, and we consider them 2 very different colors. Not all languages have that. That distinction is not common to all languages. We also, in Russian, there's an identical distinction between dark blue and light blue, sini and galuboy for Russian, and Ben Yehuda he was looking for a choice of words to parallel the color terms in Russian, and he picked kachon, for whatever reasons, and tchelet. Tchelet was just meant to parallel the Russian galuboy, light blue. That's not necessarily correct. See, sometimes Ben Yehuda got things wrong. What we do know, however, from Chazal is that Techeiles was forged using kala ilan, which seems to be understood by many Rishonim to be indigo. the plant that was used to make jeans, jeans that haven't been washed out yet. I think more accurately, the plant, we don't have any English people here, do we? One Brit, yeah. The policemen, I think they call them bobbies or something like that, or at least that's what it says in the written books. Somehow that had something to do with their uniforms, don't ask me why, but they wear very dark blue uniforms. The dark blue traditionally was made with indigo. It was one of the first major bumper crops of the United States when it was still a colony. I hope not to start with anyone's sensibilities, it's been a while. In any case, indigo was a commonly known material through the generations, and was assumed by many Rishonim that indigo is kal ilan. So we're looking for something that would be forged with kal ilan, obviously the same color as dark jeans or British policemen's uniforms. There's other midrashim that I could find. Another one is this. This is a sapphire of Tanakh. It's a stone that we know today as lapis lazuli. Not exactly what we would call today a sapphire, which probably had a different name in the ancient world. I think the identification of lapis lazuli with sapphire is conclusive. That's not for right now. There are numerous midrashim which call sapphire saphirinun, which is just a Greek term meaning lapis lazuli. So we're looking for something this color being made from a snail. The color is, I guess, dark blue with a teeny, teeny bit of a purplish tinge. It so happens to be that we know of such a dye. If you look at any of the ancient Greek texts about dyeing, about dyes in particular, there's a dye stuff, I'm not sure exactly how to define it exactly, known as purpura, or purpura, spelled with either a pi or a phi, and it's being made, discussed at great length from a snail. Hard to get exactly what the colors that are being discussed. Somewhere in the range between dark blue, purplish blue, all the way through purple and red. Theoretically, the discussion should end right here. I would venture that would be enough to satisfy our needs if we were really looking for the Techeiles. I remember years back, I think that's where I started my entire fixation on Techeiles. I think I was about 8 years old. We had in the house the Time Life, the series of Time Life science books. I don't know if any of you have seen that. And one of the books was on light and colors. And I remember reading on the bottom. I didn't bother reading the heavy stuff. In the middle, I always read the little tidbits of information around the margin. And there was something about a snail, and they made a purple dye. I read it. I go running looking for my head. Tati, I found Techeiles. It was purple. There was a little bit of a problem, but logic told me that if they can make purple, they can make blue from it too. The colors are close enough, and perhaps the colors aren't close enough. I don't know. I didn't make this cheshbon. Maybe Techeiles is purple. That's a discussion of its own. In any case, like I started saying, I really would have said that this should be enough for the discussion. Why is that? If we're going to find a dye, basically blue, from the times of Chazal, that's being made by a snail, and there's no reference in Chazal or in the ancient literature that there are two, I would look for perhaps references in Pliny the Elder, who in his monumental encyclopedia of nature, and pretty much everything under the sun, discusses everything he knows about, everything in the ancient world that was known to the Romans, and that includes, of course, Eretz Yisrael. And we could see from other books of his that he's intimately familiar with what's going on in Eretz Yisrael. After the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, even before that, you find many, many Roman geographers discussing Eretz Yisrael. Again, we're talking about the north of Eretz Yisrael under the Tyrian, Tsar, which had been conquered, by the West for a while. This is something that they're well aware of. If there's another kind of dye being made by some other kind of snail, you'd expect to hear about it from Pliny the Elder. If not from Pliny, you have writing from Aristotle, from Vitruvius, many, many other writers, and they're all talking about the same set of snails, making the same set of dyes called a purpura. On the flip side, I'd expect from Chazal to talk about, there's the Yaakov and Esav. I could totally see a medrash talking about Yaakov and Esav, and the Techeiles of the Yidden, and the Techeiles of the Goyim, and the Chilazon of the Yidden, and the Chilazon of the Goyim, and so on and so forth. That's something that you would expect, and you don't. And again, the reason for this is just like we find Zahav, Kesef, and Achoshes, which are identical for the Yidden and for the Goyim, and we never had the Zahav of the Yidden and the Zahav of the Goyim, the Yayin of the Yidden and the Yayin of the Goyim. I think that would hold true again for the Techeiles of the Yidden and the Techeiles of the Goyim. Like we find that Gemara in Eruvin that I mentioned, you find Techeiles in the street, you should assume it to be the Techeiles of the Yidden. No possibility of, hey, maybe this is that terrible perfura dye, which is not the real Techeiles. There's no such consideration. If that weren't enough for us, you'd have a number of different ways to continue down this line of reasoning and see as to whether this would hold true as we look through the rest of the material that we have, Chazal, Greek and Roman literature. One of the best sources, I would say, is Yerushalmi that we no longer have. I don't know how many of you learn Yerushalmi. Most of ours, in the Kufas Yerushalayim, and most of us who learn Bavli with the Rishonim on the Bavli and the Paiskim, you constantly bump into the Yerushalmi through the Rishonim and Ashkenaz. That's our general exposure to Yerushalmi, unless, of course, you're learning Zerayim or something like that. And as you learn Yerushalmi and Ashkenaz, through the Ashkenaz Yerushalmi, you constantly find little snippets of Yerushalmi that look very different than what we have in front of us in the Yerushalmi. If you look in the back of any Yerushalmi, there's a book by a guy named Ber Ratner, Hashlamis Yerushalmi, or something along the lines of that. There are a number of different books that were made to collect all the snippets of Yerushalmi that we no longer have in front of us. And you can find quite a few of them, particularly in the school of the Ra'avan and Ravya in Ashkenaz. They seem to have a totally different Yerushalmi. They have loads and loads of information. I don't know if anyone here has learned Beitza, Tainis. There are a bunch of different Gemaras that are discussed, a bunch of different Yerushalmis, I should say, that are discussed in the Beis Medrash from their citations in Ashkenazi Yerushalayim, which you open Yerushalmi, you're not finding them. The proposition had been made over the years that perhaps they had another book that they were calling Yerushalmi. Maybe they just, for some bizarre reason, called some early Rishon Yerushalmi, or perhaps some work of Gaonic literature was called Yerushalmi because somebody brought it from Yerushalayim. Maybe, you never know. If you look a little more carefully at the Rishonim, you see that that conjecture, which by the way was made in the scholarly world, not in the Beis Medrash, that conjecture doesn't hold any water because the Rishonim occasionally will talk about the Yerushalmi, and in the Nusach Acher of the Yerushalmi, it has it otherwise. So we're obviously talking about some version of the Yerushalmi. And they clearly considered it authoritative, something that they wouldn't have considered if it's just some other book, anonymous, from Tkufas Yerushalayim. To our tremendous siyata d'shmaya, mazel, however you'd call it, they found what's known as the European Gniza. I don't know if anyone's familiar. All around libraries in Europe, there were many books, massive manuscript volumes, that were bound with, Rahman al-San, the refuse of Ashkenazi manuscripts. A tremendous scholar by the name of Professor Zussman collected a number of pieces of Yerushalmi that were found scattered around. There was one encyclopedia that its volumes had been scattered around the world, around the medieval libraries, and it was bound with pieces of manuscript, a monumental manuscript of the Yerushalmi, and these were pieced together, and through piecing all these pieces together, they were able to get 12 pages, folio pages, massive pages of a manuscript of the Yerushalmi, 48 columns, front and back of each page. And we were able to reconstruct a lot of this Yerushalmi, and suddenly they realized that in a number of places it overlaps with parts of Yerushalmi that were quoted in Rishonei Ashkenaz, and sure enough, it has those very same expansions of the Yerushalmi that the Rishonei Ashkenaz are quoting. So that gives us a fair idea that the Rishonim and Ashkenaz have a Yerushalmi that's slightly broader than our Yerushalmi, perhaps similar to our two versions of Yerushalmi for Shkolim, whereas two avenues of transmission, one through the Yerushalmi, manuscripts of Yerushalmi, and one through the manuscripts of Bavli. Perhaps it's even more than that, but in any case, we're talking about an ancient work dating back to the times that we would consider, in general, the times of Chazal. That being said, if we look in the Ravya in Maseches Brachas, the Ravya quotes Yerushalmi as follows. In order to understand this Yerushalmi, you have to understand the backdrop of the Yerushalmi. There's a Mishnah regarding the Zman Kriyash Mashal Shachris. When is it? When do you start Kriyash Mashal Shachris? Mishiyakar Bein Techeiles L'Lavan. Lezer Eimer, bein Techeiles the Karti, right? Techeiles the Lovan, obviously you can tell them apart. One's dark, one's light. That, by the way, had a lot of influence. Perhaps this should be referenced for a different sugya. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, it talks about the time when you have to stop eating in Ramadan. And it says, when you can tell apart the black string from the white string. You familiar with this? Okay. In any case, there's no doubt that he's borrowing from Misha Yaker, like many other things in Islam. By the way, contemporary Muslim scholars have missed the reference entirely. They say perhaps it's a black thread of dawn. No idea what that means. They're not either sure. I searched online a couple of times, for contemporary Muslims in England. Yeah, at which time? Somebody actually asked, should I buy myself a black thread and white thread and try to tell them apart? See, there's a lot of discussions online about that, a couple of great Muslim forums. There's no doubt that what he's getting from, he's coming from the Mishiakim and Techeiles Karti. Techeiles Lovan, I'm sorry. And that gives you a fair indication when there's sufficient light to use it for something. Bein Techeiles Karti is a little more puzzling. Karti could mean the vegetable you buy for Rosh Hashanah, probably no other time during the year, most of us at least. At least most of us Ashkenazim. I have no idea what Sephardim do or don't put in their foods. And it's a vegetable. Karti, in English we'd call it leek. There's a different girsa in the Rishonim in pretty much all over the world, in manuscripts, in the Kara Gniza. Instead of bein Techeiles Karti, it says bein Techeiles Karton. And nobody really knows what karton means. And if you look in the Rishonim, they raise the possibility perhaps karton is some other form of the word karti, meaning a fabric the color of karti. So this shaila was discussed in Tkufas Rishonim. Not really so relevant halacha l'maisa, but we really, want to know what the Mishnah is saying. And the Rav Yah brings both potential tzadim, and he says, listen, we have a Yerushalmi that says bein Techeiles Karti, bein Profirin, or bein Prasinon. If you were to open up a printed Rav Yah, you find a slightly different gersa that has served to confuse the subject tremendously. Many people agreed over the years that if we'd have a clear translation from Chazal of Techeiles as Profir, that would be enough theoretically to link Techeiles with that ancient Profura dye in the literature, which we still haven't yet discussed how I would know today what that is. But people said, no, you have no real proof. The girsa that they had in front of them was bein Profirin or bein Prefinin. And there's a lot of wonderful, great speculations as what on earth Profirin and Prefinin is. A lot of yeshivish people are having a great fun time working out folk etymologies. Prefinin can mean whatever you want it to mean. Actually, it doesn't mean anything in particular. You won't find any real meaning, and I have a couple of fun correspondences with various scholars of ancient Greek. No, there's no such thing as Prefinin. But of course, people said, no, Prefinin is the real Profura, and no, Techeiles is something else. Or perhaps, and the general way of dismissing the Yerushalmi is a lot easier. You have no real way of seeing from this Yerushalmi what on earth Techeiles is. Why? If you look at the Gemara, bein Techeiles Karti is only one of the ways to tell things apart, but there's also bein Chamor la'Oraid. You have to tell a donkey from some other animal. Go know what it is. Mishiaker's Chaveri, from Da'aram is Chaver that's not too familiar, not familiar. I don't know. Those aren't Techeiles. So maybe the Yerushalmi is just saying that there's another time. Bein Techeiles Karti, and there's also bein Profirin and Prefinin. How would you know otherwise? Especially since we have no idea what Prefinin is. Baruch Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shem sent to us one manuscript that was preserved, actually wasn't preserved, thanks to none other than Ben Gurion. It was entirely microfilmed. It belonged to, I think, the Basin of London's manuscript library. It was sold. The track of the manuscript has been lost. But over there it didn't say Prefinin, it said Prasinan. A couple of years ago, another manuscript went up on auction, a different Sefer HaSufis from a grandson of the Rav Yah, with extensive quotations from the Rav Yah. And a friend of mine was preparing an article about it, for the auction house. tremendous scholar by the name of Mordechai Honig, and he found the snippet that you'll see in the middle of the centerfold. You can see a manuscript, obviously an Ashkenazi manuscript. Worth reading it, so you can see yourselves. Mishiakar ben Techeiles Lavan, or Beliezer Eimer ben Techeiles the Karton, right? V'kibalti, I've been makabel. Shemin seva yesh hanikr karton. There's a certain type of dye that's called karton. V'daim l'Techeiles, it is similar to Techeiles. V'chein ikr, as opposed to the other potential explanation of karton that it means a vegetable. How does he know this? The Garsinam b'Yerushalmi ben Techeiles l'karton ben porphyron u ben persinon. Now, it so happens to be that the translation of leek, karti, in Greek, would be prasinon. I don't know how many people know about the famous riots, I think at the riots in Constantinople. There was tremendous riots over the charioteers' riots. I'm the yeshiva guy. Say there. There was in Byzantium, there were a number of different chariot teams, and bizarrely enough, there were even political factions connected intimately with the different chariot teams. The empress was pro one team, and the emperor a different team. There was many intrigues to do with this. But one of the things that you do see is that we have the names of their uniforms. And one of the teams, the green team, is called the Prasinon team. Right? Because they're wearing leek green clothes. So we know that karti is a translation. If you follow therefore the statement, ben Techeiles the karton and persinon is karton, so now we can work backwards. Porphyron is obviously the translation of Techeiles. The reason why this doesn't turn up anywhere in Chazal, and this is a question that's been brought up, I think, legitimately. People ask, why don't Chazal anywhere tell you what Techeiles is, If Techeiles is porphyr, why don't they just go ahead and tell you that? I think that's an unfair question because at the time of Chazal, it was very, very matter of fact. This is something everybody has. They don't have to explain to you what a chaloin is and many other things. And therefore, they don't feel the need to explain to you what Techeiles is. Techeiles is Techeiles. Why would you bother translating? We've all got it on our tzitzis, assuming, of course, we're wearing tzitzis, right? We're not going to translate that to a local Greek word. The only reason they needed to was to clarify the context of karton in the Mishnah. Now, why was it so important for the Yerushalmi to clarify it? If you look at the regular Yerushalmi, you could suddenly understand where it fits into the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi tries to give background for this machlokes between Rebbe Eliezer and the Chacham. And the Chacham say, ben Techeiles l'Lavan. Why? Somehow, Re'isem Oisa in Tzitzis is connected to Zman Kriyishma. Don't ask me exactly how. It's in Parshas Tzitzis, right? Re'isem Oisei, that's when Zman Kriyishma starts. And when you can see Oisei, meaning the Techeiles. Okay. Now, seeing the Techeiles, you can see Techeiles in the middle of the night. You don't need any light. Obviously, what it means is that you could identify the Techeiles in contradistinction to something else next to it. So what's the next thing over? Obviously, the white strings. Mishiakar ben Techeiles Lavan, where you can tell apart, when you could discern the Techeiles from the Lavan. That's Zman Kriyishma. Rebbe Eliezer says that that's not enough. You need to be able to tell Techeiles that it's actually a Techeiles. In other words, to discern it from some other dyed material. In other words, we have Techeiles, and we're going to look for the next dye over, the next color to the left or to the right, so to speak. And when I could tell those two apart, then I've seen the Techeiles midin Techeiles. Techeiles is a dye. I've suddenly identified the Techeiles. And what's the next dye over? Karton. So Mishiakar ben Techeiles karton, it's, the Yerushalmi explains, Mishiakar bein hatzivainin, or bein hatzivuin. Amongst the dyed materials, I should be able to discern particularly Techeiles. Right? That wouldn't make any sense if I understood karton to be the vegetable karton. Because it has nothing to do with different dyed things. That entire Yerushalmi wouldn't make any sense without giving you the elucidation that we refer to karton, we mean the dye fabric, dyed the color of the leek. In order to give you this background and to clarify it, the Yerushalmi goes ahead and translates it. Why this would have been dropped out of Yerushalmi is fairly obvious. The copyists in the West may not have understood this. and this would entirely have been irrelevant to them. And like many other such statements, it disappeared. One of the Gemais I found for this, another favorite sugya of mine, Rashi originally gave a translation, or so it would seem from the earliest manuscripts you have of Rashi. Rashi gives a translation in Old French of all the stones of the Chesed. As Rashi was copied over through the generations, this translation falls out because it was meaningless to people further out to the east. And so it happens. It's not a very surprising thing. This statement, bein Techeiles akarti, bein porphyrin and bein prasinon, theoretically would conclusively link Techeiles with porphyra. If that weren't enough for me, I have a number of other people through the generations who did the same research and came to the same conclusion. Amongst them, the Chavas Yair, who mentions b'derech agav mamish in the corner of some manuscript, Karachaim on Arachaim. He says, by the way, Techeiles, we're talking about Mishiakar, is not blue, it's purple, and it's made from the porphyra fish. How he knew that, we have no idea. We have an index to all the works of the Chavas Yair called Yair Nasiv. You can see from that index that the Chavas Yair had the most fantastic wide range of interests. You can also see how much he wrote on each and every subject. I think there were 50 volumes of his encyclopedia. 1 or 2 volumes came to light over the years. The majority of them didn't. And in his index, we actually made a group project, myself and a couple of friends. It's a few hundred pages. We split it up to all our different friends, and we read through page by page to see if we can find the statement where he mentions it. And he writes here that he had a full siman about this. We just have no idea what he said in that siman. There's a book, however, that he writes in that index again, that he copied extensively out of that book. The book is called Shiltei HaGiberim. It's a book about the Beis HaMikdash and a lot of other interesting subjects. And in there he writes again, b'derech agav, porphyra is you can see it on the inside of the leaflet. I think that would be page 2. I just put a copy of that. Remes hayam aniku porphyra, v'ach Chilazon shetzayvim bei Techeiles. The Shiltei HaGiberim doesn't either tell us how he knows this. Both the Shiltei HaGiberim and the Chavas Yair were very, very widely read in the classics, and therefore they could have read it in Pliny the Elder, just like I did. Pliny, Aristotle, and many others. This wasn't a secret information. The question, of course, is brought up then, why didn't anybody go ahead and try to dig up the Techeiles? Why didn't the Chavas Yair go to the Yam? I think that's equally fair to the question of why the Chavas Yair didn't move to Eretz Yisrael. People had busy lives, they had a lot in their lives. I don't think people were as free to make choices as we are today. And even if you would have been free to make the choices, I don't know if the Chavas Yair would have known that if he would go to the Yam, he would necessarily find Techeiles. How would he know what the porphyra is? There's no end of snails. How would he know which snail the porphyra is? There are a number of ways that we would be able to tell what the porphyra is, which is how we actually know. There are many books through the ages, in the last 500 years, since the Renaissance, that have discussed at great length various classical works, Pliny the Elder's works, and they discuss which snail of today's snails, after Linnaeus, what is the porphyra of the ancients, and they all zeroed in on a snail called the murex. That's this guy, by the way. The murex trunculus, the murex brandaris. Over the years, it's gone through a whole bunch of other names: Trunculariapsis trunculus, Thias, Hemostoma. I don't know, a bunch of different names that are given over the years. I'm not sure where they're holding today, but it was pretty conclusively accepted as this snail. If that weren't enough for me, you can go to Greece, where they still eat these snails, and they still refer to them as porphyra. Once again, of course, you always like a good mesiach lefitumai, to get it like nice and yeshivish. I had a meifus maisa. We all like meifus maisas. I had a summer camp years ago. For whatever reasons, you're flying. I flew from the United States to Eretz Yisrael with my bachrim, a number of the bachrim together. I said, you should recover yourself. Airplane is a place where you're put in a lot of positions, situations different than the Beis Medrash. There's a makom to be nizhar and extra shmir sinayim. People sitting there go know what they're watching. If you're makabel, I said makabel on yourself, have proper shmir sinayim to behave like a bentayah. The Rebbeinu Shem always gives you siyata shema. You'll sit next to someone interesting. I said, watch. I guarantee you, next to me, there's either going to be someone interesting or an empty seat. Okay? This is my mifus for them. A little bit of a statistical catch. If you're a curious enough person, there's no such thing as a person out there that's not interesting. Okay? Over the years, though, I've sat next to, Rav Yitzchak Zilber, the famous refusnik. I sat next to some tremendous Yemenite scholar. I've had a lot of interesting people I sat next to. Again, the boring people are also interesting. In any case, we got onto the flight, and sitting next to me is this elderly guy from Manhattan, and the Bachram nudging me like, okay, no, where's the Rebbe's mifus? And we're schmoozing. I could not get anything interesting out of him. Some boring old gentleman from, I don't know, we are in New York. And at some point I asked him, like, why are you flying to Israel? He said, no, I'm not flying to Israel. There's a stopover. Yeah, you have a point there. So where's your final destination? So he says, I'm just going to visit my family and my childhood friends in Greece, where I come from. I said, cool, 1 second. Come here, listen to this. I said, where exactly in Greece? He said, no, you'd never have heard of it. Actually, this is where I called him over. You'd never have heard of it. I grew up in this little fishing village in Greece. I said, a fishing village? Really now? That's how I called the Bachram. I said, tell me, did you ever hear the perfura? He said, porfura? Of course, porfura. You have to make sure that you're wearing slippers, he says, when you're going on the beach. Because if you step on a perfura, your feet are going to kill for the next week. Some of them have nastier spikes than this one. It's a pretty apt description. But I said, 1 second. You'd recognize a perfura if you'd see one? He said, of course. I open up my computer, and I have some graphics from I don't know where and when. We have a bunch of different pictures of different snails. I said, can you pick out the perfura? And, a bunch of bachram waiting with bated breath for the Rebbe to be proven wrong, right? And he looks at it and says, oh, there it is. Yeah, I remember those spikes. I remember. I'm not forgetting them. And he picked it out without any difficulty. But you don't really need to use this joke. I'm saying you can go there to Greece. The reason why I bring this story is that you obviously could counter, if you can make such a die from it, maybe somebody used this scholarly work, this identification of these different scholars, and revived the name. But it's not an actual Messiach Lefitumai. I don't think that would be likely given the circumstances. I don't think that in random fishing villages in Greece, they were reading the scientific literature on the identification of the perfura, the ancients, with today's truncularia trunculus. Somehow I think they weren't doing that. Usually, we wouldn't need to go further than this. I think this identification that I presented would really be enough for Chazal, for Yishenim, to be Mater Aguna. I think the identification should be fairly conclusive. If that weren't really enough for us, there are a number of little bits and pieces of information that we have about the Chilazon that I think we'd be able to use as simanim of Hakim. Again, the difference between a siman muvak and a siman she'enim muvak, if we look through Rishonim, perhaps regarding an Aveda, if I were to lose my watch, right? There are a number of different kinds of simanim I could give. Some of them wouldn't be simanim at all. Some of them would be simanim she'enim of Hakim, which if you have enough of them, perhaps it would be a siman. Some of them would be a siman muvak. So for example, if I were to say, oh, you found my watch, yeah, it tells the time, right? It's not a siman at all, right? That would be pretty much parallel to saying, and I'm not going to go into this ba'arichas, but I would find in Medrash that the Chilazon has a shell. Oh, that's siman number one as to what the Chilazon is. No, it's not a siman at all. You just repeated your original statement that the Chilazon is a snail. If I were to say that, oh, you found my watch, yeah, it has a leather band, yeah. It's the one with the leather band. Still didn't really give a siman muvak. Why? Although not all watches have a leather band, that's entirely not unique to my band, to my watch. But if I were to say that in the back there's a funny scratch that looks a little bit like a Y, in the inside of the Y, you see there's a slight discoloration, I think that would be a siman muvak. So whenever we're talking about simanim for the Techeiles, we would have to consider, are we looking for a siman, would this be considered a siman muvak or a siman she'eino muvak? One of the things I would say is a siman muvak is the fact that it can make a steadfast die. Steadfast dyes, if you think about it, are a rarity. Really, 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 things, whenever I put together any two materials, I should expect them to fall apart, to decay. If I put paint on the house, the paint falls down, right? Because there's no integral binding of the paint to the stone. If I stain something, you give it a couple of washes and it fades away. Which is why in ancient times dyes were so valuable, such a precious commodity, and why they were often miyuchid for royalty. This is something that regular people weren't able to afford. In order to dye something, there was a tremendous amount of science that had to be known. At the time, it would be science that was brought about through trial and error. And that wasn't something that was easy to make. In ancient times, they might not have known how to, they knew how to make wine. It took quite a while until people realized that you could theoretically take the yeast from the grapes and make wine out of apple juice, right? You find the Gemara Yen Tapuchim, they had the idea of it, but it took a long time and a lot of trial and error to figure out what's going on. In order to make a proper dye, if it was able to get into the wool, absorbed into the wool, theoretically, kabbalah kachpelte, the same way like blias in a pot, it should be able to come out the same way it went in. In order to change that, you need a very, very complicated process. Not all dyes in the ancient world had that. If I have another dye that was considered an extremely steadfast dye that was also blue, and the color of kala ilan, and also made from a snail, I think that would be enough to clinch it. There are a lot of other little yediyas. Another one, the Gemara Masechah Shabbos mentions b'derech agav, that when you crunch the shell, so I'll have to finish in a moment, when you crush the shell to get the dye out, you would be careful that it shouldn't die. At the very least, it would be loy nichale. You'd prefer it not to die. It so happens to be that Pliny the Elder mentions again, b'derech agav, that when you're making the dye from the perfura, you wouldn't want it to die because after it dies, it spits out the juice, it absorbs the juice. Unclear what exactly he means, but that would still be the case today. Over here I have a sheet. I took a snail. Let's see if I can still find the part. Immediately after I killed it, I crushed the shell, and I took the dye gland, and I folded it up into the beged, and it gave me a beautiful dark dye that went straight through. I did this again. It went through, I think, 6 or 7 folds of fabric. I did this again later with the snail that I waited for it to die, took out the gland. There was so little dye stuff that it barely even left a stain, despite the fact that I tried rubbing it. There are multiple reasons for this, but it's certainly enough to demonstrate what Pliny the Elder was talking about and what the Gemara is talking about. Again, we're talking about multiple different things that I would say would be simanim v'hakim. Really, what you would expect is the fact, like we started off the shir. Okay, sounds pretty reasonable. Let's just go for a suffix deraisa l'chumra at the very least. If not a suffix deraisa l'chumra because of some kind of lamda shechap, why it's not a suffix deraisa l'chumra, the way the Mesilas Yesharim puts it, I think in the beginning of Shar Zehirus, that a person who's Eved Hashem, when he looks at a mitzvah, he says, could this potentially bring me closer to the Rebbeinu Shalom? If yes, I'm going to run after it. Right? That's the way he looks with mitzvahs. Theoretically, I think that what we've seen already today, even without going into all the finer, the small letters and the Rashi script and the various other Maramukaimis that we could check up, I think really this should be enough to demonstrate it. Lamaisa, what it boils down to, and again, I don't think it's the fact, even in people's minds, that you're waiting for the Geula to bring about the Techeiles. Klal Yisrael tends, and it's a good thing so, Klal Yisrael tends to be very, very conservative. Just like any body of law is by nature conservative, and you have strange people in the United States still analyzing the Constitution, despite the fact that it was written by a bunch of kids my age, right, younger than me, and not necessarily people with Ruach HaKodesh, but we all understand and respect the fact, even people who are not coming mitzad a ruchniistic cheshbon, even without any ruchniistic cheshbon, we're all well aware of the fact that keeping things stable and constant is an extremely important value that doesn't go any different and perhaps even more so when it comes to halacha. And Mamela in general, and I entirely understand this, the attitude of the vast majority of people in this room is probably going to be that if we didn't see our Rebbeim wearing it, so, beseder, we're not going to go on to it. But at the very least, I think what the shir should have effectuated is when you see the people wearing Techeiles, your automatic reaction shouldn't be, hey, why is that guy wearing Techeiles? But I think we should have flipped that reaction by now to, hey, why am I not wearing Techeiles? Shkach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.